Hey everyone, Clio here, and today I'm going to be talking about my reading resolutions for 2021, my reading goals for 2021. Now, I did a video like this as well last year, and basically it's a type of video or a type of plan that has only been established since I joined BookTube, because before that I never had like reading goals. I would just pick up a book whenever I felt like picking up a book. But I do actually like reflecting on it, and I do actually like kind of looking back on the year and then figuring out, okay, which direction do I want to take my reading in the next year. But in this case, it's going to be relatively similar to what I have said last year, meaning that my primary goal is exactly the same, which is reducing the amount of unread books on these shelves. I think I'm going to be going into November with about 88 unread books, which is already taking away the books that I will be unhauling in the month of December, which you will also see pop up in videos throughout the month of December. So I think it's like at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, which will be normally more or less where I will be landing by the end of December as well, because yes, I will be reading some books, but I will obviously also be getting some for Christmas. So I think it's probably going to be like end of 80s, beginning of 90s is where I'm going to be at the beginning of 2021. Now my ultimate goal is a 0 TBR, so meaning that I have 0 unread books on those shelves. This will be a one-time goal. I will reach that goal, and then afterwards I will no longer aim for that goal, but I do definitely want to get it at some point and just have a sort of reset. Let's start over from position 0. Let's have 0 books that that are lingering on these shelves. Let's just get to the point where I've read all of them, and then afterwards I think I'll maintain like a 30 books TBR or something like that, so that I do still have quite a big range to choose from at that point, but I do want to get to that 0 TBR once at least. Now, this is not going to be the goal for 2021 because it's not going to be feasible. Maybe if I read as much as I've read in 2020, it would be feasible because I have read over 100 books this year, but I'm not necessarily counting on it, nor do I want to, I do also want to slow down my reading a little bit. You know, in 2020 I just saw myself having such a good start to the year. I was reading so much, I was reducing that number by so much at the beginning of the year that I just felt super excited, and I really wanted to see like, okay, where can I get to, you know, what is kind of like, if I dedicate myself to reading most of my time, what's the number I can get to? But I don't think that I want to be repeating that. I definitely don't want to get to the point where I feel like I always have to where I always have to, you know, like one up it. So I definitely do think that I'm gonna try and prevent myself from being as focused on the amount of books this year as I was in 2020. So my plan is not to be able to read all of them. In any case, I do also still want some room for new purchases or for arcs or things like that. So I'm definitely not striving for that 0 TBR. It's also not feasible considering some of the other goals that I have, for which I might not have physical copies on my shelves. But so what is my goal? My goal is actually getting under 40. So I want to reduce it down to under 40. It's still somewhat ambitious, in the sense that I didn't reduce it by 40 books in 2020. I reduced it by that much by unhauling a lot as well, but in terms of reading I didn't get there because I also bought a lot. But so my plan for 2021 is actually going to be trying to curtail that buying part of the equation. So I still want to get a lot of books read, and hopefully I won't buy as much. What is my plan for that? I actually have an established plan for it. You know, in 2020 I was just kind of seeing, you know, this is my goal, and I had it all mapped out on an Excel sheet so that I could see things moving, but I didn't really have a plan for like how I'm going to tackle it, how many books a month do I want to reduce, and I still don't have it in that sense. But what I do have is that I have a plan in place where every book that I read will be worth 1 credit, and 1 credit is the equivalent of 3 euros, meaning that, you know, a sort of like cheap paperback, if you buy it in a bookstore, so not a second-hand sale item, would be like 9 euros, probably even more like 10 euros. So I would have to read 3 books to be able to purchase a like cheap paperback. But a lot of times book can go way higher than that, go more like towards the 20 euros, in which I would have to read 6 books in order to be able to get to one purchase. So that is kind of my goal. So every single time that I'm going to be finishing a book, I'm going to be writing down the title on a piece of paper. That's going to reflect 1 credit, and then that's going to basically be my budget to buy more books. My hope is as well that I'm going to be able to kind of prevent myself from buying new books for at least the first 4 or 5 months or so of the year. I do have some exceptions here, and that is pre-orders that I've already put in place at this point of the year, and like book subscription boxes, because January and February I will still receive a book subscription box. I don't think I'm going to renew. I'm not entirely sure. We'll have to see what I do with that, but so those books won't count, you know, I mean, I won't have the credit for them. So they are outside of this rule, but apart from that, I'm going to hope that I can keep myself from buying new stuff for like a couple of months. That's one way in which I'm going to be trying to make sure that the emphasis is really on reading rather than buying, you know, and I definitely also want to reach a point where I'm going to be using the library a little bit more. I'm hopefully going to be able to prevent that a little bit in the first half of the year, because I do definitely want to reduce the shelves first before I can actually go into library reads a little bit more. But definitely if I have something that I want to read that you know, I don't have physically here, definitely try to check out my library a little bit more first. But so that is my main first goal, reducing the amount of unread books on my shelves by under 40. So that's quite a challenge, and I hope that I'm going to be able to do so, because that would mean that the 0 TBR is within reach in the next year. So 2022 could be the year in which I reach the 0 TBR if I manage to follow through in 2021. Now my second main goal would be fantasy. This is the same goal as I had in 2020, and while I have read quite a lot of fantasy, I think like a quarter of my year was fantasy, I still don't feel like I've been reading a lot of fantasy. You know, when I look at the numbers, it's like, okay, it's a quarter, and probably like it's a quarter in terms of pages actually even. I think I ordered it according to the amount of pages. So in terms of books, it's probably not even that much. In terms of pages, it is, because yeah, fantasy are chunky chunky beasts. But so I definitely want to read even more fantasy, and I wouldn't even mind it becoming almost solely fantasy. It's not going to happen because the majority of the unread books on these shelves are not fantasy, but so I wouldn't mind it going to like 60% fantasy, for example. I definitely want to be diving into fantasy a lot more. It's a genre that I absolutely loved as a child. It's basically the genre that got me into reading. I was not a big reader until like 10-11 when I discovered fantasy, and when I really found out like this is what really motivates me to read. This is something that I can devour. This is something that I want to read. And then throughout my youth, throughout like my teenage years, I was constantly checking out the library, constantly checking out the fantasy section, and I read quite a lot of fantasy. I didn't read a lot of the greats actually, because probably they were always like borrowed out in the library, or I just didn't have an interest in it. It didn't draw me into them, and I didn't really know too much about, you know, what are the great works of fantasy. I didn't even know about Lord of the Rings, for example, until the movie was about to come out, and my mother was like, yeah, but this is a very famous book. So you know, I really wasn't immersed into the literary scene at all, so I was really just going to the library and picking up whatever looked interesting to me. But then when I went to university, I got introduced to like classics, to more literary works, and I started to explore a lot of that also when I was out of university, as there were a lot of books that I'd been introduced to throughout my studies that I'd been interested in, that I wanted to explore. There were a lot of new novels coming out that I wanted to explore, and it's definitely a genre that I still hold very dear and that I will never stop reading, I think. But I do want to shift my focus, at least for this year, because there's just so much fantasy out there that I want to read, but I never prioritize. And so I really want to take the time in 2021 to read all of those big fantasy books, to catch up on all of those big series that everybody's talking about, that I'm like, I want to read them too, but I just don't have the time for it. So in 2021, that's definitely going to be a goal. In terms of my fantasy goal, I don't have a lot of fixed goals, you know. there's a lot in my mind of like that I want to read, and I'm definitely going to make sure that I read all the fantasy that I already have on these shelves, but there's a lot of other things out there. But I also don't want to really like settle down to certain plans, but I do have a couple. So first of all, there's Cosmere. So I started reading the Cosmere 10 years ago, I guess. That's when I first read Mistborn. That's my first entry into the Cosmere, but I didn't continue afterwards. I think 6 years ago or something, I reread Mistborn, and only then is when I kind of started to seek out some other Brandon Sanderson, but really basically just when I stumbled upon it in a bookstore. Like, let me tell you, before BookTube, I really wasn't that busy with, you know, what else is out there. I was really just like in the bookstore looking at like, okay, what is appealing to me and what isn't. And so it's really only when I started to join BookTube that I really learned a whole lot more about all of the like big fantasy series and things like that, and I was really intrigued about diving into those as well. You know, all of those had been things that I'd seen on the shelves for years, but that for some reason or another hadn't really prioritized or hadn't really grabbed me at the time. And so that is when I started to read more of Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, even when Mistborn had been my favorite fantasy series since I read it 10 years ago. I had never really looked into more of Brandon Sanderson's work. So I started reading a majority of them over the last couple of years, but I definitely want to reread a vast majority of them and kind of start looking for these Cosmere connections a little bit more. I am aware of the majority of them now, but like, for example, I still haven't read Mistborn Era 2, and it has been 6 years since I read Mistborn Era 1, so I put a like thingy up here, an info graphic about what my reading year is going to be like in terms of Cosmere. So it's basically going to be heavily focused on Mistborn, because I want to read the entirety of Mistborn in 2021. I will also be rereading Elantris, Warbreaker, and then some of the novellas. And as you can see there, towards the end of the year, I'm going to be rereading Dawn Shard and Rhythm of War. I am not rereading the first 3 novels in the Stormlight Archive and Edge Dancer, just because they're fresh in my mind, and you know, I just don't have the time to fit that into my year. Maybe I'll do it like the year before Stormlight Archive 5 comes out or something, and I'll read all of those books again, spread out throughout the year. But at this point in time, it will be nice to go back into Rhythm of War and Dawn Shard at that point to refresh what has happened in there. Also because Rhythm of War so far seems to be a very Cosmere heavy book where there are a lot of connections, and I already know that there are some connections that I am apparently going to be missing because I haven't read Mistborn Era 2 before going into this. So I definitely want to reread it at that point after having refreshed all of my Cosmere knowledge to go into that. And then finally I will also feel like that I can look at the forums, can look at like Reddit and things like that, or read people's spoilers, because I've always kind of steered clear of those, because I always felt like no, I don't want to be spoiled for anything that I haven't read yet. Apart from the Cosmere, I also have 3 series that I want to prioritize in terms of fantasy series. That's going to be, first of all, the Traitor Spy trilogy, which starts with the Ambassador Mission. This is a trilogy by Trudy Canavan, and it's a sequel trilogy to the Black Magician trilogy. And I very much like this, but I'm not entirely sure yet about the sequel trilogy, but I have it, so I definitely want to dive into it. When I say I'm not entirely sure about it, the problem that I potentially have with it is that it is taking up these characters again, rather than just starting a new story with new characters. But perhaps she has enough ideas about where she wants to take these characters to make it worthwhile. You know, I don't want it to be that this story is just using these characters just because it's easy, because you can grab the public that you had from your previous series. I hope that she definitely has some interesting places to take these characters in the next trilogy. And then the second series would be the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, which is the first sort of like trilogy that she came out with. She has like a huge world in which she has like 5 or 6 series, maybe 5 or 6 trilogies that take place within that world. First one of these is the Farseer trilogy. I think 2 years ago or something, or maybe already 3 years ago at this point, I read the first book in this series, which is Assassin's Apprentice. I liked Assassin's Apprentice, however, I didn't immediately fell in love with it, and so I also always kept on stalling reading the second one. But I have seen a lot of people read it this year for Elder Lingalong, and a lot of them seem to be like, on the fence when it came to Assassin's Apprentice, but they were sold when it came to its sequel, Royal Assassin. So I definitely want to restart that trilogy and see whether I'm also sold on this trilogy and whether I can then dive into the rest of Robin Hobb's works. So because Robin Hobb is one of those that I was always intrigued about, but it was also daunting because there was like a whole shelf of those books in the library. So yeah, I would definitely be interested to see if I can dive into them at this point in time. And then the final trilogy that I'm focusing on in 2021, or that I'm committing to already at this point, is the Gentleman Bastards trilogy. It is not a trilogy actually, but there are only 3 books out at the moment, which is why I keep referring to it as a trilogy. And this is a sort of like heist pirate story as far as I'm aware, which has like a beautiful friendship to it as far as I'm aware, which is something we need more of in fantasy in general, in literature in general, so I'm definitely looking forward to that. So that is basically what I am committing to. I'm committing to reading all of those Mistborn books that I showed earlier and these 3 series. But apart from that, it is fully open. I do have some books on my shelves that are outside of that list that I do hopefully will get around to in 2021, but it is open. I will be seeing what comes my way throughout the year, or what I'm most drawn to throughout the year. Apart from these 2 goals, as every year, I have made a 12 books for 2021 video, which will be coming up next week, I think. I've never successfully completed one of these lists, and it is also not a major priority for me to do them, because usually I come to terms with the fact that if by the end of the year I still haven't read them, there was a reason for it. I just didn't feel like reading them. But so this year I'm actually going to add an extra enticement in order for me to hopefully get around to them more easily, or for me to actually feel like I need to prioritize them, and that is an extra reward, being that whereas all other books that I read this year will be worth 1 credit, the books on that list will be worth 3 credits. Meaning, if I finish a book off of that list, it's basically worth €9, which is close to the value of like the cheapest paperback that you can get in the bookstore. So hopefully that will be enough enticement for me to really prioritize and to really feel like, yeah, I want to read that one because I want the extra credit for it. Also, some of these coincide with some of the fantasy books, for example, or with some of the other goals that I will be mentioning later on in this video. In terms of the credit system, apart from that, I do have one other exception, which will be a video that is also coming out next week, which is a list of like 5 classics for which I've kind of determined like I will reward myself if I get to them in 2021 by giving myself 2 credits for them. So they're also not really priority, it's just like it's some classics that I've been kind of putting off, for example, and so it's kind of me pushing myself to pick them up and rewarding myself duly for it as well. Next up is a goal that I am taking over from past year, and that is to read new books quicker, so to read my recent purchases more quickly. So in 2020 I was trying to finish them all before the end of the year, which didn't end up happening, but in January I will be reading my recent purchases, so I will be reading or choosing some from that list that I still have from last year in an attempt to reduce that list even further. I still want to keep that intention there, that if I buy something, I hopefully will get around to it within that year. Considering the fact that I have such a large backlist, if I'm going to be adding a book to that, it should really be because it is always because I'm really excited to read that book, but so then I should also be getting around to that book more quickly. The intent behind this is really to kind of prevent books lingering on my shelves unread for a very long time. Of course, if I'm going to reach my 0 TBR in 2022, it's never going to be like a super long time, but still, I do want to make sure that I really prioritize those recent purchases, because obviously the moment that I'm buying them, I want to be getting around to them, so it's easier to read them immediately. Another intention, it's not really a goal, is to check out people's backlist a little bit more, authors' backlist, because as was clear from the Brandon Sanderson example, even when I really love a book, I'm not often like super inclined to look at like, okay, what has this person published before, and to go and check that out. I think since starting BookTube, I have become more aware of this, and it's become I'm a little bit more aware of an author's work in general, and there have been cases in the past as well before BookTube where I did do this, but it's definitely something that I want to encourage in myself, where I pick up somebody's backlist a little bit more to try and figure out, is this a favorite author, or is this just like that standalone book that worked really well for me? So that is definitely also something that I want to keep in keep on actively working on to keep an author's backlist in mind. And then another thing that I want to encourage is to dabble in a couple of new genres. Specifically, that would be sci-fi. I think I also had the intention last year to dive into sci-fi a little bit more, but barely happened in 2020. I really don't think maybe I read I think Starsight I probably read this year, so that would be my sci-fi book for this year. But yeah, one book in a full year is really nothing. So I do still want to explore that a little bit more. And so hopefully that will happen in 2021. Initially, when I set up this goal, I was also thinking about like mystery thriller. I am currently reading one, and it's really not a success story at this point. So I don't know what will happen, whether I will keep that, whether I will still dive into more mystery thriller. It might be interesting for a sort of like themed reading vlog, you know, trying to get into mystery thriller, but I really don't know whether I'm willing to make that effort. It would definitely have to be from the library, because I don't think that, it's really not my genre. I don't think it's really working that well at the moment. But so yeah, definitely non-fiction as well would be nice to dive into it a little bit more, because I do want to read more non-fiction, but I just never make the time for it. So I do want to encourage me to pick up a non-fiction every once in a while. But so as you can tell, in contrast to the primary goals that I set here, these don't have a sort of like, they are not SMART goals. They're not really, I don't have any sort of percentage that I've set out. I don't have a sort of list of like these non-fictions I definitely want to get to. So they're also lower on my list of priorities. And then the final intention that I want to set is to work with my reading journal a little bit more. And this also ties in with the idea that I want to slow down my reading, because I did start a reading journal in September or something, I think, but I never had the time to catch up to what I was reading, because I always felt like I had to keep on reading if I wanted to kind of read as much as I had intended to at the beginning of the month, or that there were always like, but I have these and these books on my TBR that I still want to finish this month. And so I really want to take the time to process what I'm reading and really reflect on it, also as a way to kind of make my reviews better, to make my wrap-ups better, and produce a little bit more like better quality work. So I definitely do want to make that sort of like habits to really reflect on what I'm reading while I'm reading as well, through the use of my reading journal, which I'm currently doing also for Rhythm of War, and which I'm very much liking, because usually I will have these sort of ideas throughout the book of where I want to see the story going, or where I think the story is going, and I won't write them down because I won't have anything with me to write in, and or just because I'm not used to doing that, and then when I get to like the end of a book, I no longer look back at those things because I no longer have them written down anywhere. I might have forgotten half of them. So with Rhythm of War, for example, now I'm really kind of like writing down what my thoughts are about the evolutions, and what I want to see happening. And so I think it'll be interesting when I finish that book to see what I initially, what my thoughts were throughout reading this one. So I do think there's merit in me trying to keep a reading journal. But so yeah, that is basically my reading goals for 2021. It was quite a long video, I think. I didn't expect it to be taken up this much time, but I think I have talked for quite a bit about these. Definitely let me know if there are any other goals that you have set, or if you're kind of setting the same ones, for example, and like what type of strategies you're using to kind of keep yourself accountable, or to make sure that you are reaching those goals. And then we can talk about them in the comments. So see you guys for the next one.